bit about history and ideas of bias and the individual and how all those pieces kind of fit together. So this is a version of a lecture that I give to some of my survey classes as kind of a way in, but I also actually give a version of this lecture to some of my seminars, just as a way to get us kind of centered and thinking, about what history is, what history means, what our responsibilities are as consumers of history, as interpreters of history, as those who are going to effectively, in many ways, make the next chapters of history, both in terms of telling the story, but also in shaping how that story is going to be remembered, how that story is going to be articulated. So, what I always like to do is kind of frame the discussion by giving you a sense of what I think history is not. I have a lot of students who come into my classes, and when I ask them, well, what is history to you? They'll say, well, history is a bunch of events and dates that you need to memorize. You need to memorize that or remember, that the German Empire unified on January 18th, 1871 in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, or, that Constantine fought the Battle of Milvian Bridge and took over the western half of the Roman Empire on October 28th, 312. And, it's the dates that you have to remember. That's what's really important. And I always push back and say, you know what? It's not memorization. History is not about memorizing things. That's useful if you're going to be, part of a Jeopardy tournament or on a quiz bowl team or something like that. Um, but history isn't about memorization. It's not about, having a laundry list of dates and events that you can rattle off. It's one thing to know when something happened, but it's far more important, in my view, to understand why it happened and what the implications of that event are, right? And how you're learning about that event. Too often, we'll sit down and we'll read a textbook, we'll read a newspaper article, and think, well, that's it. That's the story. That's what happened. These are the facts, and is there really much more to say? And what I try to imply to my students is there's always more to say, and there's always usually a lot more to say. Nothing is quite as simple or as straightforward as it's sometimes implied to be. And part of understanding the importance of history, part of understanding the importance and how shaping history can be, is thinking about how we put history together. That it's not a laundry list of who did what when, but why they did it, what those actions meant, how they were interpreted at the time, and how they're interpreted now. Um, History is also a valuable tool to understand the world that we're part of, right? History has created the here and the now. The past is the present. The past shapes the present. And how we understand the past, how we understand our present, is going to then shape our future. And that sounds a little hackneyed, I agree. But at the end of the day, that's a reality. That the power of the historian is to not only kind of shape how we think about the past, but is actually to shape how we actually think about the present and thus how we're going to work to develop the future. I say to my students, if there's something you want to change, and most students at Tufts want to change the world that they're part of. Most students who come to Tufts, have a desire to make a difference, whether that's in their local community, whether that's in their state, whether that's in their at a national level, whether that's in some organization. They have a desire to make a change, to make something better, maybe than it is. And I always say to my students, if you want to make something better, if you want to make something different, if you want to bring about change that's not ephemeral, but change that's going to last, the key thing is to understand how whatever it is that you want to change came to be. And I guarantee you, there is nothing in our world today that has roots that only date back a decade or 2 decades. Nothing. There's no major conflict. There's no major ideology. Um, there's no major kind of a perception that only dates back a few decades. Virtually everything that has shaped our society has roots that transcend not just decades, but in some cases, and in most cases, centuries. And so if there's something there that you want to alter to make different, how are you going to do that if you don't understand why things are the way they are? I describe it like going out to your backyard and say, you know what? This backyard is covered with dandelions. I'm going to just get rid of these dandelions. You go around, you pluck the dandelions, right? But you don't get the roots. You don't even think about the roots. You pluck what's on the surface and you say, okay, I'm done. I fixed it. But you haven't actually, because the roots are still there. And inevitably, whatever you plucked up is going to grow back. Whatever you think you have changed is simply going to rematerialize. And what history tells us is that ideas, concepts, um, bigotries, hatreds don't go away with the wave of a magic wand. They don't suddenly just disappear. You can think you've upended them. You can think you've turned a corner. But the reality is, if you haven't dug out the roots, if you haven't understood what had formed that ideology, it's just going to come back in a new costume, maybe with a new name, but it's the same thing. Um, and that, in my argument, is what is so important about understanding history. It's not just knowing the past, it's understanding how the past has shaped our present, um, and how our perception of the past can even shape our future. You know, I talk to my students about how important it is when you're studying history to listen to all of the voices that are out there, to try to hear all of the possibilities, all of the different versions of the story, because there's no, in my view, no one version of a historical event. There's no one and only way that something happened or what something meant, right? There are multiple interpretations of it. And the job of the historian has to be to dig out those interpretations, to hear the different voices, even if there's interpretations you don't agree with. You still need to find them and listen to them. Why? Because your own argument, your own narrative only becomes stronger when you understand all of the different perspectives that are in play. Even ones you disagree with, when you understand all the interpretations in play, even when it's interpretations that you might find problematic, your argument becomes stronger when you understand what others are saying, when you understand positions that are opposite to your own. Um, when you can explain why your version of the narrative is maybe not the only one, but maybe one that is the most inclusive of as many factual pieces of evidence as possible, um, you can only really achieve that when you have a broader lay of the land. Um, your generation has access to more information than any generation in human history. Just think about that for just a minute. No generation before you had as immediate access to as much information from as many diversified sources as each and every one of you do as we sit here tonight. And the question you should ask yourself is, do you take advantage of that? Do you take advantage of that when you're reading about a historical event? Do you look up additional articles, additional books that maybe offer alternative opinions? Do you make sure that what is presented to you as here's the truth of what happened is actually an inclusive truth? Is it one that's actually trying to really hear all the different possibilities, all the different variations of the narrative? Or is it one that's only focusing on what that author believes is their version of the truth? Which goes to also the question, is there truth in history, right? Is there the one true story? And I always say to my students that my own personal opinion, it's my own bias, is that there isn't. I have never in my career, which has now spanned 33 years, I would say ever read anything, any historical account, any article, any book that I would ever say is the true and only account of a given situation or the true and only interpretation or the right interpretation. It's an interpretation. Um, and with so much information around you, you really have to ask yourselves in your day-to-day lives, how do you process that information? Do you only go to the sources that reaffirm your existing perspective? Do you actively challenge yourself to think outside the box, to actually look at sources, to hear opinions that you find uncomfortable, maybe even that you find offensive, Because you know what? If you're not doing that, if you're not searching out those other voices, then maybe you're missing part of the story. Doesn't mean you need to agree with them. Doesn't mean it's going to change your perspective necessarily. But if you're not hearing them, if you're not processing them, if you're not understanding why people believe what they believe, then are you missing part of the broader narrative? And does that weaken your own attempt then to tell the story? Um, and I think that is, really valuable to ponder a little bit. Um, I also tell my students that there are different kinds of silencing in history, right? There is the silencing of voices that we simply don't have access to anymore, sources that were destroyed in wars and invasions during periods of colonialism. Um, there are sources that existed that have been lost to us. And there's countless examples of that all over really global history. There are sources that have existed only in oral traditions. And sometimes those oral traditions die out because new generations refuse to continue them on or simply don't wish to continue them on. So there are those sources that in some ways are permanently silenced. Um, and there's not a lot you can do about it. If the source is gone and there's no way to recover it, there's not much you can do about that. But even more insidious than that is the reality that there are countless sources out there that historians themselves simply choose not to listen to, that historians simply choose to ignore. Um, a historian comes up with their version of an event, their interpretation of it, and their sense of what they want their reader to believe was the meaning of it. And then they take the evidence and curate it to fit the story they want to tell, right? Um, are facts even facts? There's a text I use in my courses by E.H. Carr called What is History? And the first chapter, Carr challenges us by saying, what's a fact? What exactly is a historical fact? Caesar crossed the Rubicon. That's a fact. Why is that a fact? Well, Caesar wrote it down. And then countless other historians agreed that he had crossed the Rubicon and repeated that fact. So it becomes a fact. But literally tens of thousands of other people over the centuries crossed the Rubicon. Is the fact that they did it any less of a fact because we don't have as much evidence about it? It's an interesting question. Do facts only become facts because we make them so? Because we accept them? Because historians and communities and civilizations over centuries say, yes, this happened. And thus it becomes a piece of factual information. Um, but so many other things maybe are forgotten. So many other things are either forgotten or are chosen to be ignored, um, or are important to one group, but not as important to another group. Sometimes I'll ask my classes, how many of you, and I'll say, again, we're in a webinar, so I can't do this, but, in my classes, I'll say something like, all right, so by a show of hands, how many of you know about the Battle of Avarai in the mid part of the 5th century, which pitted the Armenians against the Persians? And usually nobody raises their hand, unless it's someone who maybe is knowledgeable about Armenian history um, or Armenian heritage. So that Battle of Avarai, a quintessential moment in Armenian history at the beginning of the 450s, where the Armenian people stand up, defend their land against a Persian invasion, defend their Christian religion um, against an invasion, and effectively lose the initial battle at Avarai, but win the war overall. Extraordinarily important in understanding the beginnings of the Christian history of Armenia, right? I'll sometimes say, how many people, have heard of the Battle of Kosovo Polja, battle fought in June of 1389, which pitted the Serbs against the Ottoman Empire. In Serbian history, this is a big event. By the 19th century, it becomes a symbol and a rallying point for Serbian nationalism. If someone isn't familiar with Serbian history, would they know about the Battle of Kosovo Polja? Maybe not. Even though for those who are familiar with it, and for those who are part of Serbian culture, it's actually a significant historical event and one that has massive repercussions and ramifications right up until the modern period. Um, the first shot that arguably started the process that will culminate in World War I, was fired by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo on the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo Polja. So it's interesting to think about again, how much historical events matter in our present day, but also how history is curated based on who you are, based on what your culture is, based on what your upbringing, what your family kind of experiences are, will shape not only how you think about history, but also even shape the history you learn. Because we don't all learn the same story. We all learn very different stories. The same event told in a variety of different ways. Is there's one version of the event that's more accurate than another? Perhaps. Um, but in many ways, that's in the eye of the beholder. That's in the eye of not only the historian, but of the person who is listening to the narrative and is crafting the narrative. Um, yeah, I always tell my students, the one thing that I ask you to do in my classes is to never take anything at face value. Never just read the textbook, read the sources, listen to my lectures, and say, all right, well, Proctor said this, so this is how it has to be, or the textbook said this, so this is how it has to be, or a primary source, recounted a certain event this way, so that's how it had to be. Um, Always question, always doubt, because again, the first version of the story probably isn't the best, probably isn't the most complete. And the one that's the most popular also sometimes isn't maybe the most accurate. Um, and it's up to us as consumers of information, as consumers of history, to make sure we're asking the questions, that we're always listening for additional voices and trying to find the backstory, right? Every piece of history, every event, every person, every document comes with a backstory all its own. And that backstory can be incredibly powerful. So I mention to my students sometimes, do you ever spend any time thinking about the calendar, right? So on a calendar that is used widely for international relations and international business, um, today in Medford, Massachusetts at 8:22 p.m., it is September 24th, 2024. How much time do we spend pondering, well, why? Why is it September? Why is it the 24th? Why is it 2024? On this particular calendar called the Gregorian calendar, a calendar, again, that is the most widely used for international relations and business. It's not the only calendar by any means. There are hundreds of other dating systems that are in use in our world today. But this is the one that has proven the most dominant. Why is that? Where does it come from? How did it come to be? And how does it become an international standard for international relations, politics, and business? And how often do we ask that question? So I say to my students, well, we're going to ask the question. And we're going to take a quick trip um, back to the first century BCE. The whole concept of the first century BCE is in and of itself a historical construct that I'll mention in just a minute. We're going to go back to what we would consider the first century BCE to the year 46. And we're going to talk about a guy named Julius Caesar, who inevitably most of you have probably heard of, right? And we're going to talk about Caesar. I've got a few little slides here that I'll just kind of pop up for you. Um, not what I wanted. There we go. So we've got Julius Caesar here. Caesar in the year 46, or what we now consider the year 46, is coming into a position of significant authority in the Roman Republic. He's really at the in the crux of launching what becomes his dictatorship, really, of the Roman Republic. And Caesar has determined that the Roman calendar year has become unwieldy. Um, he wants the calendar year in line with the solar year, which is the amount of time it takes the Earth to make one full revolution around the sun. Now, by the year, what we'd consider the year 46, scientists and astronomers in Alexandria, Egypt, particularly a Greek astronomer named Sogenes, Sosignes, had come incredibly close to figuring out how long it takes the Earth to make one full revolution around the sun. And Sojournes had computed it to be 365 and a quarter of a day, 365.25 days, which is awfully close, though not 100% accurate. But it's awfully close. Caesar is now convinced that this calculation is correct. Caesar, with his advisors, now says, you know what, we're going to reimagine the calendar for the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, I should say. We're going to reimagine it. And we're going to link the calendar year up with the solar year. So Caesar now, on his own authority, effectively decrees the creation of this new calendar. A new calendar which will make the year 46 known as the year of confusion, because Caesar adds several days to the calendar year, making the year 46 last 445 days to bring this new calendar now in line with the solar year. What is this new calendar that Caesar then launches in the year 45? Well, it's a calendar made up of 12 months. Sounds kind of familiar. Calendar in which, of those 12 months, each month will have either 30 or 31 days. Also familiar, except the second month of the year, which is going to be named February, which will have only 28 days, except every fourth year where it will have a 29th day, to effectively accommodate the 365.25 days in a solar year. What we would consider, of course, now a leap year. The months are going to be named after various Greco-Roman deities. One month in the summer will be rebranded July after Caesar himself. Caesar also decrees that January 1st will be New Year's Day, which it still is very much for large parts of the world today. All this comes now from a guy in Rome in what we think of as the year 46. And it applies to the empire that he governs over, which is not quite this size yet, but is getting awfully close. The end of Caesar's reign, the beginning of Augustus's reign, we'll see the conquest of Egypt. Britain has been brought into the mix. Gaul is in the mix. So it's not quite this size yet, but this is the direction that the Republic, what's soon to become the empire, is moving in. So this calendar applies throughout the territories of Rome. But again, it's a Mediterranean, realistically, empire with, again, some, control of the British Isles, but it's largely a Mediterranean empire. So how then does this continue to evolve and spread? Well, no major changes in the calendar following Caesar's death in 44. In the year 14 CE, another month is added to the year, or another month is renamed, I should say, August, after the first Roman Emperor Augustus, who'd been a little miffed. There was a month named after Caesar, not a month named after him. That's corrected in the year 14 CE. This calendar of Caesar's becomes known historically as the Julian calendar, after Julius Caesar. And again, it applies to the territories of what's becoming the Roman Empire. The calendar continues to exist in the confines of the Roman Empire. No major change again until the year 321. And at that point, we're into the reign of the Emperor Constantine. Constantine had come to power in the western half of the empire in 312 and controlled the entire Roman Empire by 324, an empire that effectively is represented here on the map. In 321, Constantine issues an imperial decree in which he makes two distinct determinations. First of all, in this decree of 321, he says that every month will be divided into 7-day weeks. Now, the concept of a 7-day week had existed for centuries over here in Mesopotamia, but it's now grafted onto the Julian calendar. And he says also, by imperial decree, that Sunday will be the first day of the calendar week, of a 7-day week, and that Sunday will be the day that Christians will celebrate their Sabbath, their day of worship. That's decreed by a Roman emperor in the year 321. That Sunday will be the day that Christians celebrate their faith. Constantine was strongly anti-Semitic. to use a modern term, but it's in a way appropriate for his perspective. Um, he wanted to separate Christianity strongly from Judaism. Up to this point, most Christians celebrated their faith largely on Saturday. Constantine wanted a clean break from Judaism, and so he makes Sunday the day of Christian worship. And again, this applies to the territories of his empire, which encompasses everything here on the map. This calendar will continue to evolve over time, over the next several centuries, and will become endemic to cultures throughout the Mediterranean region that are connected to the old Roman Empire. So once the Roman Empire begins to collapse, the successor states in the West, which includes the kingdom of the Franks here in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Byzantine Empire over here in the Eastern Mediterranean, they will all effectively maintain this system of dating, maintain this calendar system. The next really substantial change to the calendar doesn't come until the 16th century, and that comes under the auspices of a pope, the Bishop of Rome, and we'll pull up a quick image of him here as well. Gregory XIII. So, in what we would consider the year 1582, the Bishop of Rome has become very irritated that the calendar year is yet again out of sync with the solar year. Again, astronomers in Alexandria had come awfully close, 365 and a quarter days. But it's really 365.24 and a host of decimal places, less than a quarter of a day that it takes the Earth to make one full revolution around the sun. And so every year, every decade, every century, the calendar year had slipped further behind the solar year. Gregory XIII wants to fix this. His astronomers now know the exact amount of time it takes the Earth to make one full revolution around the sun. Again, 365.24 and a host of decimal places. Gregory now decrees in the year 1582 that October 5th will not be followed by October 4th will not be followed by October 15th, by October 5th, but rather by October 15th. He slashes 11 days out of the calendar. And now this calendar is rebranded as the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar upon which today is September 24th. And I see, I think, a question from Charlotte. Let me see if I can let you, okay. I think, Charlotte, you can post your question if you'd like to.
I can also have Charlotte speak if you're down for that, Professor.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, feel free to unmute Charlotte and ask your question. Don't know if we can hear you, Charlotte.
I don't think we can hear you, unfortunately.
Yeah, you can also feel free to just pop it in Q&A. And
The slides aren't updating. Okay, I will see what I can do on that. I'll stop the share and reshare it, see if that helps a little bit. See if that proves to be a little bit better. All right, so let's continue on. So Gregory XIII again makes this really momentous change in the calendar, and this is the birth of what we think of today as the Gregorian calendar. But you should be thinking to yourself, all right, it's 1582. Europe is divided between three different branches of Christianity at this point: Catholicism, led by the Pope, various Protestant groups, and Orthodox Christianity. Of those three groups, only one, the Catholics, actually care what the Pope thinks. Protestant countries like England could care less what the Bishop of Rome says, and Orthodox countries like Serbia, Greece, and Russia also have no interest and what the Bishop of Rome is saying in terms of things like dates. So, how does this calendar then become a global standard? Well, that's the additional piece of the story that is oftentimes forgotten or ignored. It becomes a global standard because of Western European imperialism. Part of the story of imperialism is the spread of the Western European dating system. Over time in Western Europe, Protestant states like England and some of the German states will accept this calendar because the majority of their Catholic neighbors are utilizing it. Some Orthodox Christian countries will not always willingly, but grudgingly accept it to put them in better stead with their more powerful Western European neighbors. But the nations outside of Europe, for the most part, will not be given a choice. As Western European power spreads, and I always, when I talk about imperialism, make a point that it's about Western Europe. The Greeks and the Bulgarians are not working to conquer anybody except their own backyard. Um, West imperialism is about the British, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Germans, the Italians, even the Belgians eventually. They're the ones who are expanding empires into Africa, into Asia, um, and into the Americas. And with them, they bring not only their language, which they impose, they bring that not only their method of political organization, the notion and model of the nation state, which is a Western European construct that is taken from Western Europe and then imposed literally on millions of people all over the world. Um, but even more insidious than that, even more insidious than forcing language, even more insidious than forcing ideas of political organization, what the Western Europeans bring with them is also their method of marking time. And nothing allows you more control over a people than to force them to mark time the way that you do. You can work to erode their language. You can work to erode their political identity. But when you start working to erode how they actually mark the day to day of their lives, um, that is really working to gain a level of control and domination. Um, the calendar spreads as European imperialism spreads. And where the Western European goes, their dating system goes with them. Um, if anything, the Gregorian calendar is another legacy of imperialism. And the story of why it becomes an international standard is about imperialism, is about the spread of Western European authority and attempt to control other peoples. Um, and then there's the whole issue of the year, right? It's 2024. According to whom? Well, according now to a method of dating years that by the 16th century had been melded onto this calendar of marking months and days. Who comes up with the dating system for years? Well, it's one guy, this guy right here on the screen, a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, um, in what he would eventually declare was the year 531. Um, decreed that he had computed the exact date of the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, why was he doing this? Well, about 8 years earlier, the Bishop of Rome, Pope at the time, had come to him and said, you know what? I want a better way to date my archives. You know, up to this point, he'd been dating them for the reigns of the emperors in Constantinople at this point. And he said, I need a better way to do this. And it should be a way that is unique to Christianity. So Dionysius is a monk in Rome. He says, all right, well, perhaps the best way to date a Christian archive, which is what the archives of the Pope in Rome is to date it from the birth of Jesus Christ. But when was Christ born? He now spends the next roughly 8 years calculating when Jesus Christ was born. And in what he decrees is the year 531, he says Christ was born exactly 530 years earlier in the year one. Right? Concept of zero, the year zero, the concept of zero is not present in Western European mathematics in the 6th century. So it's the year one. Now, modern scholars argue that there is evidence to prove that Jesus Christ might have been born 2 or 3 years earlier than Dionysius Exiguus computed, but that he maybe came kind of close. Um, he also, after announcing this, says in order to make it clear that this method of dating is connected to Christ, when you put the year, 531, for example, you will also put the initials AD, which in Latin is Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, to indicate that this is a dating system based on the birth of Jesus Christ. This becomes melded to the Julian and then the Gregorian calendar, and hence it's the year 2024. As the Gregorian calendar spreads in the 19th century in particular, not only do the days and the months spread, but the method of marking years spreads as well. By the 1950s, there's a sense that AD and what had evolved several by the 17th century or 16th century BC, before Christ, that these two monikers were problematic. In an ever more globalized world, to mark the years from the birth of Christ was problematic. But this was a now deeply entrenched dating system that had been forced on literally millions of people all over the world. So how are you going to change it? Well, scholars say, well, you know what? We'll just change the initials. Rather than AD, we'll say CE, which initially meant Christian era. And we'll change BC, before Christ, to BCE, before the Christian era. Okay. Others say, but the Christian era is that, yes, for Christians, but there are literally billions of people on the globe who are not Christians. And thus, how does this really help matters? By the 70s, you have a new incarnation of things. All right, we'll keep CE, but now it's going to be Common Era. And BCE will be before the Common Era. Okay. Well, that's interesting, right? But then scholars begin to say, well, Common Era exactly for who, right? Because common implies something that's generally accepted, right? Something that is maybe even agreed to. And this dating system was not agreed to by the vast majority of people who it was imposed upon. So is Common Era arguably better than AD? Well, you can argue in some ways, yes, it's more comfortable, certainly. But does it hide the reality of how this dating system was created, and a reality that comes as it's imposed with a lot of bloodshed? And should that be something that we don't forget, right? So when we look at a date on a calendar, should we at least think for a split second about the history of that calendar itself, um, and how many lives actually were sacrificed as that calendar was imposed on peoples all over the world? I think it's just an interesting example of how something as really basic and simple as a date, right, can carry with it an extraordinary amount of historical baggage. And that takes me to what I'll wrap up with tonight. Um, as I was implying as we started our discussion, history is not simple. If anything, it's incredibly complex. There is no right or wrong answer, I'll tell my students. There's only a variety of different answers. Um, you can't be wrong when you're interpreting history implicitly, because history is all about interpretation. You can be wrong factually if you said that, Napoleon Bonaparte was the first emperor of Germany and he lived in 1871. You're factually wrong. That's not correct, right? Um, but when you talk about someone like Napoleon Bonaparte and say, was he a child of the French Revolution? Was he a megalomaniacal dictator? Was he a little bit of both? All that's interpretation. You can look at the exact same facts and come up with two distinctly different answers. One of my courses is bookended by two of these examples. We start the course with Constantine, and we end the course with Napoleon. And they are in many ways perfect bookends, right? Who were they? Well, Napoleon, the child of the revolution, the man who made the French Revolution real to the French people. In many ways, he did. He's also the first emperor of the French, builds the first modern French empire, and in many ways is a dictator who seeks to dominate all of Europe. Which view of Napoleon is the right view? Or is there a right view? Are there just variations of possibilities of how we should interpret Napoleon and his actions? Certainly, with no Napoleon, the revolution never would have, by the beginning of the 19th century, reached the level of completion in France it did. But was that completion real or kind of imaginary? Without Napoleon's armies, ideas of liberalism and nationalism would never have spread as quickly to places like Prussia or Austria or even Russia. But how do we view that? Um, how do we think about that? Is that making Napoleon's claim that he was a child of the revolution? In his memoirs, he said, had they let me govern, had the forces of conservatism not worked to destroy me, I would have freed the people of Europe from the chains of oppression and ushered in an age where everyone would have governed themselves. Even, he said, my own rule and that of my family would have faded in the light of freedom and liberty. Um, does the fact that Napoleon's actions helped to usher in transformation in Europe in the 19th century, does that give fodder to his own rhetoric? Or is his propaganda at the end of his life just that? An attempt to do what he'd spent his entire career doing, make the French people believe that he was necessary to their future and their success, and to make the French people believe that he truly was a child of the revolution. In his memoirs was his final goal to manipulate not just the French people, but manipulate history for all time to come. Again, you can take the same set of evidence and you can come up with a multitude of different interpretations. Was Constantine the first Christian emperor? He's usually assumed to be because he's very favorable to Christianity. But did he actually believe in the faith? We don't know. Some of his actions indicate he did. Others argue that maybe he was just a political opportunist who saw in Christianity a potential of a new unifying ideology. Again, same evidence can tell two totally different stories about who Constantine was and what he actually believed. Um, you can have tons of evidence that, again, can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. And some scholars make use of all that evidence. Other scholars, though, make use of evidence that is only relevant to what they want to argue. And that goes to a point I mentioned at the start of how there are different kinds of silenced voices, right? Um, there are silenced voices, again, whose voices have just been lost. The sources have been destroyed. The oral tradition has died out. We just don't have it anymore. But there is also, and as I said, far more insidiously, the sources that are there that we just don't listen to, consciously choose not to listen to. And I always use an example from a course I teach on the Byzantine Empire. And it's of a woman named Pulcheria, Pulcheria. Pulcheria is, by any account, a really fascinating woman. She is going to come to power in the year 414 at the age of 15 years old. She assumes control of what was then the eastern half of the Roman Empire, what some of us would consider Byzantium. And you can see that kind of here on the map. Basically, the region of Cappadocia, Asia Minor, Egypt, um, areas down from Syria to the Arabian Peninsula, top of the Arabian Peninsula, and then areas of the Balkans. Um, she's going to govern all of this in the name of her brother, Theodosius II. Um, she takes control of the regency for her brother in the year 414 at the age of 15, right? Now you're thinking to yourself, well, this is a young teenage girl taking control of half an empire. So arguably, and on this map, it's even, I think, clearer to see it's what's in kind of the purple and the violet. Clearly, she probably was a, power name only, right? No. The sources of the time, historians writing in her own lifetime, explain that this was a real regency, that she threw out a lot of her brother's former advisors. She had an extraordinary work ethic. Anybody who didn't live up to that work ethic was pushed aside. Um, when she took the throne and was crowned by her brother Empress, took over the regency. She declared herself celibate for life, took a vow of virginity, and declared her loyalty to her brother and to her God, the Christian God. Throughout the rest of her time in power, she is going to oversee a host of transformations in the empire. She is going to oversee two councils of the Christian church, one who defines who the Virgin Mary is, the other who defines who Jesus Christ is in Christianity. Pretty big ticket items for Christian history. Um, she's going to build a new wall around Constantinople to defend it in addition to the wall that had been built by the Emperor Constantine. Um, she's going to launch the creation of the University of Constantinople. She's going to launch a new set of legal codes. Um, and we know from the historians of her own lifetime that she's doing this. Um, the mantra of the period was the empress makes policy and the emperor signs it, right? So the sources from her own lifetime, and there's quite a few, indicate unequivocally who the real power in the capital of Constantinople is, who the real driving force is bringing about these changes. It's a well known fact in her own lifetime, and the sources of the time make it clear. All right, skip ahead a little bit. Um, Study of Byzantine history, Eastern Roman history, what we would consider Byzantine history. Basically, again, at its core, the regions in the kind of the pinkish purple and the purple here. Um, that's a scholarship that is going to continue to evolve. The empire itself dies in 1453, but research on it continues into the 16th century and reaches a high point in the 17th century in France under Louis XIV, who's fascinated by this Eastern Roman or Byzantine history. Huge amounts of sources are collected from the empire's history, are organized into collections, um, and well preserved. The story of Pulcheria, the story of the civilization she was part of, um, was well documented, and those documents, to some extent, modestly well preserved by the 17th century. So, what happens? Well, we get to the 18th century, in the age of the Western European Enlightenment, and we come across a brilliant scholar named Edward Gibbon. Gibbon writes his Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, considered one of the greatest histories of the Enlightenment period. In this history, he basically lauds the old Roman Republic and the western half of the old empire, Italy, North Africa, Gaul, um, as these symbols of extraordinary cultural development right up and through the beginning of the fourth century. He talks about the coming of Christianity in the empire, something that changes the empire not in a good way. And then he talks about what he calls the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. And his final version, or his final view on Byzantium is, you know what? They were overly religious. They were not full of martial spirit and martial vigor. He found particularly repulsive the idea that the Byzantines throughout their history would rather bribe an enemy than fight them, that they'd rather send a bag of gold than pick up a sword. They would fight you if they had to, but they would always, always, always work to use diplomacy and bribery to avoid conflict. And in Gibbon's world of the late 18th century, this was repulsive. They were weak, they were effeminate. They didn't have the martial spirit and martial vigor of a great people. When you read the Byzantines' versions of events for yourself, though, what is clear is they make these decisions not because they're fearful, not because they're afraid of battle. They make the decisions because to them, it was a lot less to bribe an opponent than it was to fight them. It cost a lot less monetarily, dramatically less, actually. But moreover, there was another thing that it cost a lot less of, and that was human life. If you could bribe an enemy and not lose one single life in doing so, was that not worth the bribe as opposed to going to war and picking up the sword? And for the Byzantines, a peaceful solution, even if it was a bribe, to them was more noble than sending soldiers out to be slaughtered. Gibbon did not see it that way. Gibbon's assessment of Byzantium now condemns Byzantine studies to the wastebasket of history. From the end of the 18th to the beginning of throughout the whole 19th century, Byzantium is no longer studied. It's not worth being studied, according to Gibbon and others. Why would you study a people for whom there is no value to their story? They're too religious. Their religion dictates everything, also not actually correct. Um, he condemns an entire civilization that lasted for 1,100 years, right? 1,100 years 1,123 years and 18 days, depending on when you date the beginning of it. He condemns it to the dumpster of history. Um, and it remains condemned until the beginning of the 20th century when a French historian named Charles Deal digs up, not literally, but figuratively, some of these Byzantine archives that have still existed in Paris. And he says, you know what? There's something really fascinating about these people, something fascinating about their version of Christianity. It's a lived version of the faith. There's their doctrines, but then there's how they live the doctrines. And the actual written version doesn't always fit with the lived experience of how they make these ideas real. And he found that fascinating. And so he says, you know what? And he finds their political ideology in terms of foreign policy fascinating. And he says, you know what? Maybe we should revisit them. And he writes a book, first major book on the Byzantines in a century. And who's it about? It's a series of biographies about Byzantine women. That's who he writes about, Byzantine women. Uh, and he brings their stories to light, right? His work is going to be followed up by a man named George Ostrogorski and a host of other scholars in the first half of the 20th century. Um, Ostrogorski becomes the godfather of Byzantine studies. If you're going to study Byzantium, you got to read Ostrogorski, right? When you read Ostrogorski and the host of other scholars that come after him in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you will be loath to find any mention of the Empress Pulcheria. She doesn't exist. All of her achievements are credited to her brother. Almost every single one of them is credited to her brother, who the historians of the time acknowledged did virtually nothing. Um, so this is what I mean by chosen silence, right? People like Ostrogorski choose to ignore the sources of the time that clearly indicate where the real power resided, who actually made the decisions, who actually guided the empire in this period. The evidence is there. It's as plain as this piece of paper. The evidence is there, but people like Ostrogorski refuse to listen to it. In fact, they refuse to acknowledge any of the extraordinary women that make up the history of Byzantium. Women who are acknowledged for their extraordinary contributions in their own lifetime by historians writing about them during their own lifetime. But 20th century scholars choose to ignore it. Why? Because they come from cultures, Germany, Soviet Russia, where the idea of the centrality of women in politics is not something current in their day to day experiences. And historians are shaped by who they are, by where they grow up, by their own lived experiences, and they shape the history to fit what they think is the best narrative based on who they are, where they come from, what they've come to believe. And historians will ignore sources that are as plain as the nose on your face. They're not hidden, they're not buried, they're just ignored. And in my mind, that's even more insidious than the voices that have been lost, the voices that are there, that all we need to do is listen. And historians simply refuse to, because those voices offer a narrative that is counter to the one that they want to share. Um, so that's a kind of little overview of a couple of different themes that I try to bring forward in some of my introductory lectures. We've got a few minutes left, so I will open it up for any questions that anybody might have. So I think I've got a couple already in chat that um, I will mention. Um, how do we restore traditional methods of marking time, and should it be done or just acknowledged when we go about approaching other cultures' worldviews? I think the first thing is to acknowledge the multitude of other calendars that exist. There's the Islamic calendar, the Jewish calendar, the Chinese calendar, the Indian civil calendar, the Persian calendar. There's a litany of other calendars that exist. So when you begin to explore other cultures, I think one of the most important things to research is how do they mark time? They may use the Gregorian calendar for international relations, politics, business, but there are other dating systems that continue to exist. And in most cases, there absolutely are. And to understand and appreciate those, I think is really important for all of us. And to respect the idea, that the way we ourselves might mark time, however that is only one method of marking time, and that there are a host of others which should be equally respected. Um, Second set of questions. In what ways do subjective translations influence the way history is interpreted? And are those impacts positive or negative? How do modern perceptions of time as nonlinear through other religions and Christianity continue to work within the expression of time forced upon those people? Two excellent questions. Let me deal with the first one. Translations. Translations are great and also incredibly dangerous. Um, Translators are just like historians. They can make a text whatever they want it to be. I had a student who did a senior honors thesis looking at a guy named John Dryden, an English writer at the end of the 17th century, who translated Virgil, Latin writer, Virgil's Aeneid from Latin into English. Now, if you've read Virgil's Aeneid, it's not actually rah rah empire. It's actually pretty critical of the beginnings of the Roman Empire, of Roman imperial expansion. Um, Dryden translates it into English, invents entire sections. There can be a section in the Latin that's 5 or 6 lines. Dryden's translation has 10. Why? Because he transforms the whole meaning of the text. It goes from what is largely an anti imperial piece to one that is overwhelmingly pro imperial expansion. And Dryden does that to serve the needs of the British audience. Britain is at the cusp, the very beginning of building its vast empire, the largest the world will and hopefully will ever see. Um, they're just at the beginning of that moment. And Dryden now provides a historical narrative that says, well, we're going to do just like the Romans did. Um, Virgil says how great empire is, according to Dryden. And people read Dryden's version of Virgil, and it seems like Britain's going to reduplicate what the Romans did. When reality is that when you read it in Latin or in a more faithful translation, Virgil is actually opining against empire. And there is a much more faithful translation that comes out about 20 years after Dryden. Dryden's is a bestseller, to use modern terms. It is widely read and applauded in every literary magazine all over England. Um, the more accurate translation is panned by quite literally everybody because nobody wants to actually read a translation that's true to what Virgil actually said, which is actually critiquing empire, not embracing it. Um, and that, how do modern perceptions of time as nonlinear through other religions than Christianity continue to work within the expression of time forced upon these people? Again, this is another great question. And, idea of how time function varies dramatically from cultural heritage to cultural heritage. Um, and I think you can find certain examples of cultures that have worked um, to, again, adapt to the realities of a method of marking time that's been imposed upon them while also, remaining true to some aspect of their pre-existing heritage. Um, One very simple model, I think, from Eastern European history actually is Greece. Um, Greece accepts the Gregorian calendar begrudgingly in the 1920s, but they will maintain the um, dating of all of their religious festivals, all of their Orthodox Christian ceremonies by the Julian calendar. Um, Again, it's a small example, but you can find far more dramatic examples in parts of Latin America and particularly in parts of Central and Southern Africa, parts of East Africa, where pre-existing traditions, both of marking time day to day, but also marking time within the context of a day, are still in some ways retained. Um, and then another question, how would you suggest ways to confront our own personal biases when it comes to history? This is a great question, and it's not easy. I say to my students, when I start my lectures, I'm as biased as anybody else. Don't take what I say at face value because I'm a product of my civilization, my culture, my education, um, my family, you know, so got to keep that in mind. Every course I teach, regardless of what it is, the Byzantines get a mention. That's one of my biases. I think the best way to confront a bias is to acknowledge that we have it. to acknowledge that we're coming at things from whatever our perspective is, to not be ashamed of that in any way, um, and but to acknowledge it, to embrace it, to understand it, and so that when we look at something, we can say, all right, well, how am I looking at this? How does my own personal experience filter how I'm seeing this? And are there other ways that I could see it? Are there other ways to think about what this person did or said, or what these events meant? And I think the key thing is just to acknowledge that it's there, um, and not to be afraid of it, to acknowledge it and to then confront it. And to again be open to asking yourself, all right, here's how I'm interpreting this, but is this the only way? And what am I missing? Where else could I go to find more information? What voices, should I be asking why they're not here? Are those voices that we simply don't have, or are they the silenced voices that are just waiting for someone again to listen? Um, and I think we got time for last two. When thinking about how the Gregorian calendar was imposed by Western European powers on their colonies, can you give an example of how colonizers used time to control the people in the lands they colonized? Um, I mean, absolutely. Um, when you look at the notion of imposing, again, a 24-hour kind of time frame, a 7-day work week, and ideas of when you work and when you don't. What is a work day? That can vary from culture to culture, civilization to civilization, craft to craft. As the Europeans come in, there's the imposition of a more standardized kind of idea of, well, this is when you work. These are the days you work. You don't work on Sunday because most of the Western Europeans are Christians, and there's this notion you shouldn't work on Sundays. Well, but why? I mean, why not work 7 days a week? Why not work, every day but Monday? Why not work every day but Wednesday? There's this sense of we will orchestrate you to not only think the way we think, but to work the way we work, to produce what we want you to produce on the schedule that we want you to produce it. Um, and you can see, in examples, perhaps one of the most truly horrific, the King Leopold of Belgium, when he takes control of the Congo region in Africa, and he brings in these military forces to basically just take everything. He destroys the bulk of the population, destroys the natural resources. Um, and, the men that he sends in to exploit the indigenous population, will work them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no breaks, no rest, because they've got quotas to fill and they need to produce, they need to harvest X amount of rubber trees in X amount of days to fulfill this X quota. And they need X amount of workers to do it who need to work X amount of hours, on their 24-hour day, 7-day a week calendar. And there are countless other examples, of how this comes very much into play. How can students best interpret history and identity in their college application essays to bring forth their whole selves? I think that's probably a question better for Brent in admissions than for me. But I'll take a quick stab at it. That I think you just need to be you know create an application that you feel represents who you are, that represents all the nuances of who you are. In your college essays, the goal is to show who you are and what you as an individual are bringing to the table. And what you bring to the table as an individual can include aspects of your community, aspects of your community identity, as they're filtered through you and what you bring, to your college community. Um, And then lastly, in my classes, do we look at different interpretations of text and how they inform our biases? We try to, yes. I have my students get irritated with me sometimes because in some of my classes, I'll have them read like 3 different accounts of the same thing. And in my course evaluations, I usually get some irritated comments like, why do we have to read 3 accounts of the same event? And the reason is because they're told 3 different ways. 3 different authors, same evidence tells them in 3 different ways. So I try to do that in what I present to the students, but more importantly, I try to get the students to not take anybody's interpretation as their own, but foster their own interpretation. Here's all the events. Here's what happened. Here's different ideas of why they happened, what they meant. Now you and your papers tell me what this all means to you. And I think that's the most important thing. What I tell my students is I don't want you parroting back what I said, what the textbook says. I want you to be the historian. Take the evidence, assess it, analyze it, and then tell me the version of the narrative that makes sense to you. Acknowledging that you're going to have your own viewpoint, your own bias. No two students are going to tell the story the same way. And that's incredibly valuable because it allows us to all think not only in ways that make sense to us, but then be exposed to how other members of our class think about it as well. And that can be really eye opening in my experience. All right, I kept you an extra 10 minutes, which I apologize for, but thanks so much for zooming into this. If you have any additional questions, my email is david.proctor@tufts.edu, first name dot last name. Please do not hesitate to email me with any questions. I'm always happy to answer anything I can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Proctor. And regarding the question that you answered on my office's behalf, I could not have phrased it better myself. I think, when we read a lot of different applications, we want to see what you bring to the table. What would you contribute to the Tufts community? And we want to find those community members who, as Professor Proctor mentioned earlier, are really, looking to make that difference in the world, really looking to contribute to the Tufts community. And, the easiest way to do that is really just be your genuine self, because I think it's the easiest to write about, being genuine. So couldn't have agree more with that. For the rest of you guys, thank you so much for joining us here today. As a quick reminder, we have more events going on, Fall for Tough Stuff. Lots of other great things. I believe our most kind of popular sessions that we have this week. On Thursday, we're doing a student experience panel. So maybe you want to hear from actual students who go to Tufts University and not, two people on payroll. Maybe you want to maybe you want to hear from people who are actually living kind of that Tufts experience right now. I think it's a great experience. To hear from those students. So feel free to sign up for whatever you're interested in these coming weeks. But it was lovely kind of listening to, again, Professor Proctor, and really kind of engaging with all the different questions that you guys had. So again, thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much again for joining, guys. Thank you. Hope you have a nice rest of your day. If you have any additional questions for my office and admissions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining.